Okay, welcome everybody to our webinar on rough cut capacity planning. Let me shortly review the agenda with you. So I'll take 5 minutes maximum to introduce Solventure. I'm very happy that Adrian Bentley has accepted to share the McBride experiences on rough cut capacity planning. So Adrian will shortly introduce McBride as a company, also introduce what are the reasons for McBride to have installed a rough cut capacity planning process. I will explain a bit more on how we see supply planning in general as a step in the broader SiOP process. Olivier will give a short demo of the Archiva capabilities on RCCP, and then we want to come back with some of the experiences on the McBride side, and we will also try to make sure that we have time for some Q&A. So let me start with a short introduction. So we have a series of webinars. So this one will be on supply review. So for people who attended the previous webinars, they already know that as Solventure, we really try to be active in the full SiOP cycle, starting with a more tactical, strategic segmentation of customers and products, which basically should steer all of the steps in the SiOP process. Product management review, which links into the product managers and R&D and is managing the product lifecycle aspect, and specifically the introduction phase, where we see that a lot of the business cases are overstated, but at the same time, some forecasts may be underestimated. So being short on the ball there is essential in making the NPI process work better. And the end of life, where we see that a lot of companies keep too many products for too long. So how do we avoid getting with too much obsolete or non-moving inventories? That's two key questions of the product management review. Forecasting, demand review, I think is well known. We had a webinar on inventory optimization. This one will really talk in detail on supply review, so the supply planning, where basically the forecast or the demand is an input and where the optimal inventory parameters are an input. And supply planning is really the step before we can go to the executive SiOP, where we want to hold a webinar on in December. At Solventure, we really combine process knowledge, so we're not just tooling consultants. We try to bring advice on how to organize your supply chain processes. We use the Archiva tooling. In fact, we are distributing it into Europe, and we use the tooling to improve processes. We try to have good knowledge on analytics. If you think about demand planning, it could be statistical forecasting. When we will be talking about supply planning, it's clearly something like linear programming, optimization techniques, which you can help or which can help you to optimize your plans. And make sure you also don't forget the people aspect. I will also come back to that today in the context of the supply review, because not every company may be ready for a more advanced solution like the LP optimization. This is the same process. Here you see some more detail on the different topics we will cover. I will come back to that later in the presentation. Some of our customers, so we really work cross industry. Supply planning challenges can be quite different across industries. Okay, we will see specifically on the situation of McBride, which are some of the challenges for them. Being a private label company, heavily depending on distributing into the bigger retailers. We have two types of approaches. On the one hand, well, we are distributing and implementing the Archiva software. We also do analytics as a service, which you could more say it's a consultancy project, but software based, where the tool is really supporting a process improvement project. That's basically what I had foreseen as a short introduction to Solventure, and I'm now happy to pass the word to Adrian so he can introduce McBride as a company and also explain a bit more on why McBride has taken the initiative to implement an RCCP process a couple of years ago. So Adrian, over to you.
Thanks, Bram. So my name's Adrian Bentley. My role is Head of Supply Chain Planning at McBride. So we cover everything associated with the SiOP process and also all the local scheduling and material planning activities across the business. So if I talk to you about McBride on the next slide, you can see we are Europe's leading retailer, leading provider of private label, household and personal care products across Europe. We have 15 factories across Europe and additionally some other facilities in Asia, but we don't cover those ourselves. And you can see that we have quite a substantial volume. We delivered 1.2 billion units of products across Europe last year, and we're involved with 49 out of 50 of the major European retailers, and I think we've got the 50th one as well. So we have broad scope. I'll touch on product range in a moment, but you can see we've got a broad supply chain footprint across Europe, broad product supply to a large number of retailers. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see some of the range of products. So I can pretty much guarantee that everybody will have something of our production in their house somewhere. We're producing laundry, dishwash, cleaning, toilet cleaners and air care products across many different formats for all of the retailers. Obviously leaves us quite a large number of SKUs, normally about 4,500 SKUs at any point in time, with reasonably short life cycles of about 9 months to a year, and then they tend to get relaunched in different formats. So that's the kind of household range. We've also got a large volume in personal care and aerosol products, which is the next slide. So once again, you see we've got coverage across pretty much all areas that are relevant in the personal care product category. So a significant number of products, but the thing that does make things a bit more straightforward is that our supply chain is relatively simple. We basically buy in chemicals which we mix. In most parts we have an in-house bottle blowing operation, so we blow our own bottles, probably about 700 to 800 million bottles a year. We fill those bottles off and then we're into the warehouse and distribution. So in terms of the actual processing and filling activities, relatively straightforward. We have about 200 different filling lines across the group. So what we've got is a large proliferation of SKUs and assets and factories, and that's the real challenge we have, is about getting our hands around all of that and being able to get the right level of control. The FMCG private label market is always challenging. The demand changes over different horizons and for different reasons. So short term we've got volatility of the short term market, so promotional activity, product changes, everything that's going on within the retailers. Obviously commercially we either gain or lose contracts over time, which distorts the forward volume, and then the longer term backdrop is you've got changes in product markets growth, so different aspects of our product ranges are growing or declining, and equally which retailers are winning over other retailers in different geographies. All of these lead to a kind of continually evolving demand situation across different time horizons for different reasons. So what we needed is a process that would allow us to understand what the demand is doing, but then what the impact of that is on our factories. So the key for us as a business is how we maximize our profitability in the future, and so what we need is more and more clarity and information and insight into the market, and also then how that impacts on our production capabilities and what we need to do. So we need to expand the coverage of the RCCP process to increase that visibility and allow for greater control over our supply chain. So the questions that we were faced with a few years ago, sort of how are we going to manage all of that challenge for the business and get us in a position where we can make the right decisions on the right timescales. And so that's why we introduced the RCCP process that we have. It gives us that visibility. We have a demand plan that runs out for 18 months, and we use 18 months of all of that data for the RCCP process. So we've got an 18-month view of what's required at a factory level. And that helps us make the decisions on the right timescales, because for us, investing in a new asset or adapting production assets is somewhere between 6 and 12 months. So that's quite a reasonably long timescale compared to the changes that we see in the market. So it's about our ability to predict and then our ability to act on that information on the appropriate timescale. If we move on to the next slide. So what that process allows us to do is to make group-wide decisions. So when you've got so many factories and different assets, you need to be able to corral all that information together to make decisions across groups of assets about optimizing production in the short term, what do you make where, but also about how do you align your asset base for the future. So it gives you an insight into the future requirements of the asset base. Obviously you have other information in the business about longer term trends that are coming in, where we would see that we want to invest in the asset base, and how do we bring all of that together to maximize the factories in the future to drive that profitability question that I referred to before. So I think if you go to the next slide, yeah. So I'll hand back to Bram and let him take you through the detail.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, a couple of slides, and in fact I have too many, so I will shortly review some of them. You will all receive the presentation afterwards, so there will be more detail probably than we can handle in the time we have available. But I will try to shortly show like what is the framework we use to organize the supply planning step in general, and then specifically on RCCP. Olivier will give a short demo on how Arqiva can support RCCP also in your company. When looking at supply planning, we try to combine three dimensions. The first one, which I think is well known, is the vertical or the hierarchical dimension, which kind of defines that you are doing planning on different levels of detail. The second one is the supply chain dimension or the horizontal dimension, because we may need to plan DCs, we may need to plan downstream, upstream operations. We may need to plan key suppliers, and it all needs to work together. And the third dimension is certainly a combination of the maturity and the complexity. You can have pieces of the business which are somewhat lower in complexity. You can have more complex pieces, more complex business units, and depending on the complexity you have, you may require a different, let's say, level of advancedness in the solution, and also a different level of maturity. So these are the three dimensions we want to shortly cover. Starting with the first one, so I think a lot of companies do have different planning processes on different levels of detail, so to speak. Many companies do have a strategic planning process, 3 to 10 years horizon, driven by the CEO or the BU president or a strategy office. We may look at the data in yearly buckets, a relatively high level of aggregation, and what we primarily try to do here is kind of set a commercial direction of the business, what will be the innovation plans, major capital investments, any acquisitions of that or divestments, any potential partnerships. And what's in it for the supply chain is that, well, this really defines often the supply chain network. Where are the customers? Which assets do we have? So in a certain sense, it also defines the supply chain challenge. Many companies then have a budgeting process or a budget plan, 1 year horizon. We typically do it for the next fiscal year. We may either not review it, or we may do a half-year review. I've not seen too many companies which really have a quarterly review. This one is certainly driven by finance. Level of aggregation somewhere on the intermediate level, for instance, a combination of a sub-region and a product group. Well, on the one hand, the input is the strategic plan. So where do we want to take the business? So next to a plan, it also often is a kind of a target setting. We may set certain targets for volumes, for pricing, for costs, for margin. We also allocate the financial resources typically through the budget. So the goal here really is to define a financially viable plan for the next fiscal year. And we often see that this plan is also a bit stretched, which causes some stress in the SiOP process. The level we are really talking about here is the aggregate planning or the rough cut capacity plan, 12 to 18 months out. This plan is really supply chain driven. Level of detail could be comparable to that of the budget. This one is typically driven by the SiOP forecast, which is meant to be a realistic forecast. So what's the most realistic expectation of what's actually going to happen in the market. Ideally, it's aligned with the financial forecast and the budget, but that's of course not always the case. We try to identify bottlenecks. So will we have structural shortages in capacity? Do we have significant seasonality? Will we have major shutdowns? Will we have to deliver major tenders? So we try to look at bottlenecks, and we also try to look at the appropriate solutions, and I will come back to that. Yeah. The goal really here is to define a realistic, cost-efficient and viable tactical and operational plan. And yeah, the goal of this plan may be different, for instance, from the goal of the budget plan. So we feel some tension over here. In planning, we commonly talk about a free, flexible, frozen period. Well, the frozen period is really defined by the distribution and the production lead time. This is really the domain of the detailed scheduling, of which we will not talk today, but we will have a webinar next month, November. Master plan extends that horizon really to include supplier and supplier lead time. So based on the MPS, we want to be able to order key components, key raw materials, and make sure that in a later stage we can actually produce what we need to produce. The RCCP is more playing in what we call the free period, where there is little to no commitment to any of the own assets or any of the suppliers yet. So this is really the zone we're playing in. This also indicates a kind of a difference between the RCCP plan, which remains on a relatively mid-term basis, remains more aggregated, and some of the more operational planning processes like the detailed scheduling and the master plan, which go into more detail and which also are looking at a more short-term horizon. Master plan will not go into detail, but as I mentioned, shorter time horizon, we may start using weekly buckets. Instead of only looking at the forecast here, we might also start including orders. That depends a bit on our manufacturing strategy, or we make to stock, assemble to order, make to order. We try to plan the mix, where the RCCP is more concerned about getting the volumes right. Here we are really also concerned with the mix. We also account for mix variances. We may start grouping SKUs into certain campaigns. We may also need to prioritize certain demand streams. So this is all characteristics for the master planning. And detailed scheduling, well, we will have a webinar on that next month, so we'll not go into detail here. Also the summary, I think this is helpful for a lot of companies to make sure that what are the different levels of planning we need? What are the current levels of planning we have? Do we have all of them? Do we need all of them? Well, in general, we see that if you try to take a level out, it typically puts a stretch on the remaining level. So at least if you think you can take a level out, be aware that you will need to adjust the other levels and expand them a little bit in comparison to the definition we have used here. But I want to continue with the second dimension, which is the horizontal dimension. So we actually have a supply chain to plan. We go from customers to DCs, downstream assets, upstream assets into key suppliers. We take the forecast, the orders, use DRP typically to calculate the dependent requirements on the production, and then use MRP to translate the requirements from the downstream into requirements for the upstream, and requirements of the upstream into the requirements of key suppliers. And so if you are doing planning in a supply chain, DRP and MRP are critical tools to kind of explode that demand throughout the network. And whether you are doing master planning or whether you are doing rough cut capacity planning, you will need these basic capabilities. If we look at RCCP, well, basically it's done on critical resources, and critical resources depend on the supply chain and can basically be everywhere. Yeah? If I have very heavy seasonality, it could be that I have an issue in somewhere in the DC, in one of my nodes in the distribution network. Yeah? It could be that my main constraint is in the downstream production, of that I say at least for certain parts of the year, I know that I have an important constraint over here. The constraint might be in the upstream part of your production, or the constraint might even be at key suppliers. Yeah? The key supplier may really depend on the scalability of the overall supply chain. Yeah? The first step in RCCP is really defining like what is the critical asset, because that's the one on which we want to plan the capacity. That's what we are doing, planning the capacity in a rough cut way. 4 basic options, I think, which Olivier will also show in the tool. If I have a constraint over here in one of my DCs or whatever it is, an option can be to offload demand. So temporarily, instead of delivering from this location, have a customer or a region being delivered from another DC. So this can help us to relieve, temporarily relieve a bottleneck. Second way is, of course, to increase capacity by putting more people in the plant, changing the number of shifts. We can increase or decrease capacity in function of the demand. That's basically a chase strategy. I might also look for outsourcing opportunities. Depending on my type of production, I may have an opportunity to outsource parts of the flows. If I'm in chemicals, I might also look for swap deals and say, okay, I'll give some of my volume in Asia to a competitor if I can get some of his volume over here in Europe or in the US. A third option is basically to build inventory, right? So if I know that the supplier's capacity is limited and he will not be able to follow, building inventory is probably the fourth option when we are looking on how to relieve bottlenecks or let's say relieve critical assets in critical moments. So these are the 4 basic options. Combining the two, remember that we said we had a hierarchical dimension. We also now have a horizontal dimension. And the different things need to integrate. We need to integrate vertically or top down. So the budget would typically define certain targets for the volumes, the cost, the inventory that will act as the input for an RCCP type of process. An RCCP type of process may define certain allocation rules and say, well, we will in those months deliver those volume from those production sites of those distribution centers. Those allocation rules may be input to the next level, which is the master planning. We also need the horizontal connection. So on the one hand, we start from the market demand. We will use DRP and MRP to calculate that upstream. We also may need the red arrows, which is typically the pegging, because if in the upstream assets, I cannot, let us say, produce everything I do require, I may need visibility on the downstream orders or the downstream demand streams that will be affected to be able to make good decisions. So whatever planning process you're looking at or whatever planning vision you are trying to build, having a view on all of these is probably critical to make sure that you have the right plan, let's say, for the longer term, also with internally for your planning processes. Last topic I wanted to cover is the maturity and the complexity. So we do see that there is different levels of complexity, right? Some environments are more simple, some are more complex. So what could be some signs of complexity is shown over here. If I have shifting bottlenecks, if I say, well, sometimes the bottleneck is in the downstream, sometimes the bottleneck is in the upstream, it's difficult to predict. Multiple bombs or recipes for the same finished product, so multiple ways to make the same product. Complex changeovers and production wheels. If I'm asset intensive, sometimes we see that we need to continuously load one of the upstream assets to remain cost competitive. All of these elements are typically things which increase the complexity of your planning process and of your environment. If your complexity is low, well, most probably you can do with a basic solution, right? It's what is required. It's also what we suggest. If your complexity is higher, we do believe you need more advanced solutions. But as I will also show on the next slide, if your maturity is low, we do advise that you start with a basic solution, because if you immediately try to jump to an advanced solution, the change process might just be too big. Look at the left, right? What's the quality of the master data? What's the quality of your cost data? What's the experience of the planning team? Do you have any recent experiences with improvement projects? if there's a lot of question marks over here, there's simply too big a risk to immediately try to jump to a more advanced solution. So the change management aspect is quite important when you look at supply planning. And what are different levels of maturity and complexity we see? If your complexity is low or your maturity is low, we advise to start with a so-called planner-driven approach. Planner-driven means the planner is in the lead for the basic decisions in supply planning. Whether we want to increase capacity, whether we want to offload demand to another resource, whether we want to build inventory, that's typically a planner's decision. And the bad thing is that it requires manual work, but the good thing is that the planner understands what he's actually doing. If you are currently working in an Excel environment, switching this to a more professional tool already cuts out a lot of waste and non-value add in VLOOKUPs and sticking one Excel file to the next. So there is already a significant improvement potential if you make this type of step. In this situation, we say each plan follows the other, so it remains quite sequential. So we might first do the RCCP, then look at the master plan, and then look at the detailed schedule. That's the first step. Next step, rule-based. So the planner here will be partly in the lead, and I think the game is here to automate some of the basic rules. Like if you see that every month there's a couple of manipulations you need to do to the plan, and you kind of see the recurring effect, it's better to capture those things in rules and use a rule-based engine, which can make the work of the planner more efficient or more effective. As you switch to a rule-based engine, we typically also see that the borders between the RCCP and the MPS start fading, because as some of the basic stuff is automated, the plan can contain some more complexity, which no longer requires the two plans to be really split up. Next step, optimization. So optimization is really a different type of approach. Well, instead of managing the plan and managing the outputs of the plan, the plan will now be calculated by an optimization engine. And it really requires a different skill from the planner, because instead of managing the outputs, the planner now really needs to manage the inputs. If you switch to optimization, you typically try to do it cost-based, or you try to make it margin-driven. If you start doing it cost-based or margin-driven, the level of your cost data and master data needs to be quite good. And if you have that level of quality of the data, you will also see that the RCCP kind of allows you to easily do a quarterly update of your budget, at least on the supply side. So we also see that part of that budgeting capability will be taken into, let us say, the tactical planning process over here. And really the next step, and that's where Arqiva as a company is also making significant investments at this time to take things to a next level, is what we call dynamic optimization, where we basically say, well, over here the boundaries between RCCP and the master plan are probably gone, because in an optimization engine it's possible to at the same time look at the volume and the volume complexity and the capacity planning, but also look at the mix complexity and see, okay, how do I, for instance, group items in a certain sequence to make sure that I minimize cleaning cost and so on. The next step is certainly to also take the schedule into that same planning model, which gives you basically one planning model from the scheduling up to the tactical capacity planning. And it will be one plan where you basically have different views. So you may require, for an SNOP purpose, a monthly view, let us say 6 to 18 months out. And you may need, for the detailed schedule, the daily view, and well, basically it will be one plan which you look at from different angles and at different level of detail. So 3 dimensions. The first one was vertically, so really look at which which type of vertical planning dimensions do I have, which ones do I need, and if I think I can skip one, what's the impact on the other ones. The second is certainly the supply chain dimension. So where do I have my critical bottlenecks or my critical assets? These will be the focus for the RCCP. And please don't forget key suppliers. You may also include key distributors or channel partners. And the third one is look at a combination of complexity and maturity. If your complexity is higher, you do require more advanced solutions, as we've shown over here. You might require an optimization solution, yeah? But don't jump the gun. If your maturity is still low, make it a step-by-step approach. And that's also kind of the vision we have, we share with our customers, and the plan we take our customers through.
So as Bram talked through, it's that sort of maturity and complexity chart, the last slide that he showed. I think it's key that you to kind of understand where you are. So when we started out, we weren't really on the chart because we didn't have anything in the RCCP box. So it's key that you get everything lined up, and I think we're now in a position where we're then moving across the kind of range of boxes that you show from left to right as you get more complex and more mature to be able to deal with the complexity that you have within your business. So when we started and introduced that, what it brings is a set of challenges, because you bring a new source of insight in the company, and it challenges existing perceptions and historical rules. So people have spent a lot of time operating whatever processes you've had before, have established some credibility around those processes and built some of their reputation on it, and then you come along and with a new data set and challenge it. So that's about change management, and Bram talked about change management within the team, but you've also got to consider change management within the broader business, because you're going to start unsettling things that have been perhaps in that way for some time. It's key to understand your data and any local processes that you've got going on, because what we find is that if you don't understand it clearly enough before you start, then you come up with issues later on. We fell into that on a few occasions, where you interpret the data one way and actually it's telling you something else. It's about understanding that. But you certainly need good people to manage and drive that process. So the people that you're using to develop that RCCP master planning box, those kind of areas, yes, of course, they need to be technically skilled, they need to understand the business, they need to have planning skills, but because you're bringing a new message to the business, and to a certain extent you're potentially changing the source of what drives decision making within your organization, then they need change management skills and good interpersonal engagement and influencing skills as well. So it's quite a sweet spot of skills that they need to drive that change internally in the process, but also within the business, and get that level of engagement in the business as well. So that's kind of our experiences. It gave us that level of visibility that we were looking for at all levels in the business, and we can pull the business together behind that one set of numbers now, and we get much smoother processes around decision making, because it allows us to link everybody's sets of numbers together, operate off one set, and it fits with operational and investment decisions, and it just drives the process through. So capital expenditure, for example, is much more straightforward because there's one set of numbers driving that decision making process. It also improves the long-term demand, because the commercial teams can see that you're using that demand to drive the future of the business and to accommodate their future needs. And therefore, the better they are at putting their information in, then the more likely they are to get what they need in the future. So you actually get a positive driver for commercial behaviours around demand planning, because you're using the data more, and the more you use it, the more they see the value. The more they see the value, the better your process becomes. So it helps to kind of make that a positive cycle. And it sets a clear direction for everyone to work around. It starts to reduce the number of surprises, better alignment, less firefighting, and obviously as you go through that spectrum of maturity that Bram talked about, that's the message that keeps coming all along that path. So for us, it's been a good experience. It's helped the business a lot. It's moved planning more to the centre ground in terms of how we run the business. And we're now kind of a key provider of information to pretty much all functions based around this data, whereas historically it was probably everybody would try and do it themselves, and we'd end up just discussing the numbers rather than the issues themselves. So it's been a good process, and one that we need to continue. So if we look at what we do next, what we need to do next, we need to expand it to cover more of the business. So blow molding in our case would be the equivalent of the upstream production that Bram talked about earlier, filling being the downstream. So that's an area that we need to cover. We didn't cover it up first because it's not as critical in terms of there's less pinch points in capacity terms in there. So we did the most urgent bit first, and I think it's another key message that start small and then grow, because I think if you try and tackle everything at once, then you just find it very, very complex. We need to integrate more with the finance processes. Our demand process is integrated with our financial process, and we use one set of numbers there, but we kind of financially evaluate the factory costs separately to the RCCP process. So we need to link those together, and then we can start using one set of numbers for finance on both the commercial and operational side of the business, driven from the plan. And we need to further integrate it with our short-term supply chain processes. So it's that link from RCCP down through master planning and into short-term scheduling, because it's okay to line the world up neatly in the RCCP process, but you've got to actually make it happen as you go through. And it's about driving behaviours for us where in the short term people were kind of responding to the external market and not really being directed by a longer term plan. And so it's now about follow the longer term plan, hold your nerve, stick to what the longer term plan tells you what to do. If the short term doesn't quite look like you expect, don't worry, just keep going, rather than reacting to what's the external stimulus of that day or that week. So lots of challenges still to tackle, and it's about trying to use the planning process to drive the business more, align everything with it, and use it to drive the actions that we take on a daily and weekly basis. Okay, I'll hand back to Bram for Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. So there is time for questions, so you can just drop your questions in the question box, and as we see questions popping up here on our screen, we will try to either have Adrian answering, or we can try to give an answer here from our side. Okay. I see a first question popping up here, and I actually might suggest to pass that one maybe to Olivier. Like, the question is, does the tool also track demonstrated capacity from historical inputs?
Yeah, the tool can track that. It's a very good benchmark. For example, if you see that percentage utilization of your line, and the demonstration was at 90%, if you see that you continuously are not getting historically the performance that you are aiming at, you might want to, for future planning, also let that impact that percentage that you're using to calculate your available capacity. So in any case, it's a very valuable addition to any RCCP exercise as well. And it's possible to have that in Archiva.
Okay. Question, Adrian, which I will pass to you, and the question is, which output of the RCCP process will be sent back to the ERP? So if you can maybe comment on how is the output of the RCCP used into any other system?
Yeah, this is one of our challenges that we're tackling now. So when we first started, it really was sort of almost a standalone piece of information that would allow us to make choices about the longer term. But obviously what we want to do is try and drive that into the shorter term. So what we do now, we take the anticipated production requirements for the future, and we bring that down into a weekly process which looks at what we need to be producing over the next 13 weeks, which is kind of that master planning horizon that Bram talked about. That gives us a guide by week, by production line, by production site, what we need to be producing, and then that's what we try and schedule the lines against, so that if we're need to drive stocks up, for example, to cover off a future imbalance in demand and supply, then we can see that we're driving the scheduling through the planning down to the scheduling to actually be producing additional volume now to build the stocks up in advance. So we need to do more on that, but that's how we drive it. We don't currently feed it directly to the ERP system. We do it more as an offline direction. But that's where we need to go. One of the things we need to do next to link it all together more dynamically.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. Another question here: can it also provide pre-production proposals in case we are getting out of capacity only in a given month and at all the lines? Maybe I would like to comment on that one and also refer back to how advanced do you want the solution to be? And if we look at how we implement, we typically start with the basic planning, depending a bit on the maturity of the planners and also the complexity of the environment, where if you want to, let us say, bring production forward, you basically first have the planners doing it. The next step would be capture that in rules, and Arqiva also has a rule-based engine where you can automatically bring forward production quantity. So once you know that at certain times in the year on certain lines or for certain products or product groups or families, you will have that type of requirement. Yeah, you can easily automate that and put it in a rule. Yeah. And the next step then remains the optimization, where there's basically different types of automated decision making which can be done, but it requires a high maturity to make sure that that people understand what's happening and that they don't consider it as a black box, because then you risk that they stop using it and that they revert back to their old way of planning, which in a lot of companies is still the Excel way. Yeah. Another question. Yeah, I'll pass this one maybe to you, Adrian. The question is, can you handle different scenarios of demand? So are there any scenario management capabilities, or how do you look at that?
Yeah, we often get questions from our commercial teams because we ask them to build in some things that they think will happen into the forward demand, but the less likely but perhaps more significant things we often run scenarios around. So yeah, we push different scenarios in. Generally we keep the demand signal clean and just stick to one set, so then we manually enter the additional demand to be able to see what else that would give, and then be able to run production scenarios on that, generally around, would it fit within the existing capacities on that line, perhaps additional shifts, or do we need to use backup lines, that sort of question. So we still look at it from a practical point of view. We haven't yet got to the point where we integrate the financial analysis with that as well. So we tend to look at what that would mean and then feed that information to our finance colleagues, who then try and do an assessment overall as to whether it's the right choice for the business. But yeah, we drive additional demand in separately and then model that.
Maybe last question. I might pass this one to you, Olivier. So the question here is, do the RCCP calculations consider inventory? Do we start from inventory targets in days or sales or something like that?
Yes, of course we can handle it. So Arqiva will calculate the net production requirements based on the current inventory that you already have in stock. So that's information that can be coming from, for example, from your ERP system. Then it will add that if it needs to build up extra stock to satisfy your targets, that will be added to your net production requirements, and that will then also be part of your required production capacity that will be taken account into the tool. So yes, that's possible.
Okay, so if you would still have questions, don't hesitate to keep posting, but I suggest we close the webinar here. Let me thank Adrian to share the McBride experiences. I also had the feeling that Adrian kind of confirmed, like, you'll need to start somewhere, so take a look at a different hierarchical level in the planning processes. You'll need to work on the different levels. You'll also need to work on the integration. Also look at the supply chain or the horizontal aspect, because also at McBride we've been working on the filling, but the next step might be the blow molding, which is more upstream, and take care of the of the maturity. Like, it's planning is, or improving the planning process is really a change management process, and okay, it's tempting to kind of immediately try to jump to the technically most advanced solution, but be aware of the risks that it takes. And I think also Adrian, from his experiences, has kind of shared that probably splitting it up in steps makes it at the same time rewarding and also more realistic. So we hope you enjoyed the webinar. We want to thank you for attending. Let me also thank Adrian once more for his participation, and we hope to see you back next month. We will have a webinar on scheduling. We'll also send out the slides and the recording of the webinar. You can also find recordings for all of the other webinars we have done. We also have a webinar schedule planned for next year, which we will communicate shortly. So in summary, we hope to provide you with relevant content, and we also hope to see you back. So thank you, and hope to see you later.